Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Corentus First Friday with a Thought Leader. We are so pleased today to have Amy Elizabeth Fox with us. She will be properly introduced by Alexander in just a little while. We welcome people from all walks of life today. This is an open session. We've invited people to join us who may be new to Corentus, and if you are, welcome to our global community. We are professionals united in advancing team effectiveness. We have made connections to people for over 30 years through many different associations and institutions, all represented here. And we invite you to engage with us on an ongoing basis through our Corentus community on Disco. And you can see the link here in the bottom of the slide. If you'd like to join our community, we'd love to see you there. And with that, I'm going to introduce Alexander Kaye. Alexander is co-founder of Corentus. He's an internationally recognized organizational psychologist, consultant, and team coach known for his pioneering work in team coaching and state of mind research. With over 30 years experience across 5 continents, he's led organizational transformations, business turnarounds, and culture change initiatives for top executives and teams worldwide. And with that, Alexander, my friend, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Let me first start by saying hello to everyone, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us during this time together. I am extremely delighted about our session today because I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing and then having a conversation with Amy Elizabeth Fox, Amy Fox, Amy as I know her. And we're going to really dig into some really important topics today, so really hope that you'll enjoy. Let me first begin by introducing Amy. Amy is a globally recognized leadership strategist and trauma-informed consultant. Amy has spent over 2 decades guiding Fortune 500 companies through deep culture transformation. As CEO of Mobius Executive Leadership, she integrates psycho-spiritual principles and trauma-informed practices into executive coaching and vertical development programs, helping leaders navigate complexity with agility and purpose. And with that, I'd like to welcome Amy into the meeting. Amy will begin by sharing some slides, and then we will have our conversation. And then we'll open up to all of you to be able to ask her your questions, which is a really important part of our session. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Alexander. It's such a treat to be with you and your global community. I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation and really honored to be part of what you're building at Corentus. So thank you for having me.
You're so welcome.
I'm going to take your invitation and just share a little bit of foundational slides on the work that you've just alluded to that I've been had the privilege to be guiding for the last 20 years. And then let's just dive into our conversation, which I think will be the richest way for people to get to know what we're both up to. So you mentioned the sort of 2 pillars of my work. On the one hand, I'm really trying to help organizations to understand the enormous role in shaping organizational culture that untreated personal, family, and collective trauma has on the way the scaffolding of that cultural cartography gets built. So let me just say a minute or 2 about what we mean when we talk about trauma and how that might show up in organizational life. So one way to think about a definition of trauma is that it's anything that in the moment the mind and the heart find overwhelming to process. It's an event or challenge that simply swamps the system's ability to metabolize the emotional and sensational response to that event. And part of us starts to sort of get frozen in time in our inability to meet that moment. And that emotional content walks with us and takes up part of our operating system until those memories and experiences can be really integrated, healed, and transformed. So that's on the one hand a personal dimension of trauma, but because of my teacher Thomas Hübel's pioneering work over the last decade, we've also come to understand how much shared ancestral and collective trauma plays a role in leaving people with the aftermath of overwhelming emotion and overwhelming experience. And I just wanted to share, I think, this radical and potent definition of trauma that comes from Dr. Menachem's work on racial healing. And he says, if something traumatic happens to you, the march of time will decontextualize it. Trauma in a person over time can look like it's their personality. Trauma decontextualized over time in a family can look like it's part of the traits of that family. And very importantly, trauma decontextualized in a people can start to look like culture. So those of us who aspire to be healers, facilitators, team interventionists, coaches, practitioners working with individuals, teams, or even organizations or societal structures in the effort of restoration and renewal need to, I believe, have a trauma-informed lens for understanding what we're seeing, and in particular for interpreting things that might otherwise look like executive derailers or leadership weaknesses or inexplicable behaviors that seem exaggerated in the current moment, but really have their roots in much earlier survival strategies. So what does that look like? Just to sort of lump together the most common neurological responses to this oversaturation, this will be probably familiar to almost everybody on the call, are survival responses. So we know that in the face of trauma, our neocortex, our cognitive processing, our meaning making and problem solving function shuts down, and we move into a heightened state of arousal. You just talked about, are you above or below the line? One way to think about the pulse check that you're teaching us is a check of, am I in a creative mode, a resourced mode? Am I in a reactive, more survival, truncated, myopic mode? Those common behaviors show up on teams all the time. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, Alexander, because I know you work with teams over many years trying to help them unlock the aftermath of fight, flight, or freeze behaviors showing up in the team dynamics. So maybe we'll just put an asterisk there for a moment. So why does this matter? It matters because often the trauma symptoms, the things that we do to take care of ourselves in the context of the overwhelm, linger long after the impinging threat or danger or challenge has resolved. So you start to see 20 years later, some of these early childhood survival strategies still operational in a person's default behavioral routines. And if you want to help address them, you have to really be able to see with a longitudinal lens where these behaviors are sourcing from. It's also the case that people who have been traumatized are more vulnerable and more susceptible to being under-resourced and overwhelmed in the next occasion of challenge. Or we could say in the current context of business, they're less likely to stay resourced when the adaptive pressure is constant and the sense of stress and overwhelm is exhausting everyone. So we have to have a heightened sensitivity and attunement to those people who may be at risk of suffering that same collective experience in a more powerful and decrippling way. And maybe I'll just pause there because I want to get quickly to our conversation together. And if there's time another time, I'll share the other slides.
We do have a little bit of time if you'd like to share them.
Okay, well, they're
Yeah.
precious, so I'll go back to them. Thanks for your
Yeah,
patience.
absolutely.
So the next slide is just a picture of a cave, and it says the Heart Cave. And it was my instinct to share the other half of my work, which is how spirituality and the expressive arts and somatics and a lot of other aesthetics, the world of the poetics and the world of the intimate and the world of the beautiful and the world of the ecological can be resources, not just for organizational vitality and team dynamism and creativity and innovation, but also for deep healing. So one of my teachers and dear friends, Shai Tubali, talks about the 3 chambers of the heart. And I love to share this because I think it both gives us a trauma-informed lens as well as a sort of glimpse at the antidote. So the outermost layer of the heart chakra, Shai teaches, is the part of your emotional body that's just responding moment by moment to the external circumstances of your life. So something happens that's joyful or nourishing, your heart gets happy. Something happens that's sad or grief-stricken and your heart gets hurt. It's responding in proportion to what's going on around you. But what makes it challenging, particularly for those of us that are trauma survivors, is that the middle layer of the heart is the historic hurts that you walk with and the long-standing fear and terror that you carry. And when the challenge happens in the external world, it reverberates and activates that buried unconscious emotional content, which is why trauma survivors are more vulnerable to a challenging external circumstance. So we have to be sensitive to when somebody's having what looks like a disproportionate response, that they're not just responding in real time, they're responding in real time with the echo of a more ancient difficulty or a more ancient pain. The innermost chamber of the heart, Shai describes as the heart cave. And that's the part of you that cannot be hurt by life circumstance. That's the part of you that's always in touch with being part of a more unitive field that has access to the numinous. has little spark of the divine inside your innermost being and your most essential self. And when we can help people touch into that contact with the numinous or contact with the eternal or contact with the pure center of their soul that's unharmed by life, that can become an incredibly fertile strength to tap into, particularly as people are getting more shaky now and the world is getting more anxious and uncertain. So what's the work of a facilitator in relation to all of this emotional content? And this is the last image I want to share. It's to, first of all, turn our own attention towards our pain and our sadness and our grief and our emotional pain body, and to cradle and be intimate with and learn to really befriend all of the shadow emotions that historically we might have felt too under-resourced to hold or too alone to face. So the first work of a facilitator is to do their own healing work. And then once you've done some bit of that path or journey of inner wholeness, you become a wellspring of holding and harboring and witness to other people's pain. That process, neuroscience tells us now, that simply somebody meeting you and deeply listening and pausing to receive your emotional experience of your life as it unfolded has a kind of co-regulatory capacity, or helps somebody in a heightened state of nervous system arousal calm down and touch into their own inner equanimity and calm and access that heart cave. And so I think of this image as such a beautiful illustration of what we need to do to hold ourselves and to create sanctuary for one another.
You know, one of the questions that I have for you is, you do a training with coaches and facilitators on trauma-informed work. And I'm really curious for all of us to understand, what exactly is that work? What does it mean to do trauma-informed work?
Thank you for your question. It's something I'm deeply passionate about, as you know.
Yeah, I
And
do.
last year, I had the wonderful privilege of leading 200 coaches and facilitators in a year-long study of exactly at least a beginning answer to the question, what does it mean to be a trauma-informed practitioner? I feel like as a collective of organizational healers, we're just beginning to open the door of exploration of what it would look like, because I think we're only now willing to admit the prevalence of trauma symptoms in organizational life. And it's still relatively avant-garde to go to a corporate client and say, I want to do trauma healing inside of your organizational system. What do we mean by it? First of all, we mean taking time to become literate in the quite vast literature about how early childhood trauma, both what happens and what doesn't happen in the attachment and developmental process, both can have huge costs: absences of attunement, absences of cherishing, absences of emotional aliveness and receptivity are as costly as an early, parental illness or a relocation or alcoholism and addiction in the family. Many, many, many different sources of trauma. So the first is to just start to have an awareness that this is a driving dynamic in every leader that we work with, and to understand that each leader has an adult dimension of their psyche that's high functioning, that's often very productive, that has a lot of access to their strength and resource and intellect and multiple dimensionality of creativity, and a regressive dimension that's much younger. When people get triggered in their trauma, they actually lose their adult capacities and their adult functioning. And then we as practitioners need to be having a conversation with a sensitivity that we're in dialogue with someone who looks like they're in an adult body, but with a facet of their psyche that's actually much more tender and much younger and less resourced. And those conversations have to happen in a very different pace and with a very different orientation from the coach or facilitator, because in that moment, you are providing the parenting or adult function for the younger part of that leader. And that's a very different conversation than problem solving, for example, about their next career trajectory.
Or the organization strategy,
Or the organizational strategy, exactly.
or whatever the organization is about. Yeah.
And I think the third thing is that we reorient ourselves to looking at what is otherwise considered executive derailers or executive weaknesses or dysfunctional patterns, because the current way we approach those things has the risk of reshaming somebody for the very things that their psyche brilliantly innovated to do in a context in which there wasn't a better choice available to them. So being trauma sensitive means I bring not only compassion, but reverence for what otherwise I might judge if I'm not trauma informed. And I bow to the role that that played in their earlier life. And that bow opens up the possibility that their psyche can lay that repertoire to rest and be freed up to do something more liberatory, more generative, more mature in that moment.
And what does this mean for organizations? You've used the term trauma-informed organizations and trauma-informed leadership. How does this translate?
I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear how you think about it in your own team interventions, because my supposition is that many coaches who've been doing team mediation, team intervention, team coaching over the last 2 decades are often doing trauma, addressing trauma symptoms, but not naming it that way. When you watch two people who have different perspectives and can't calm down enough to even hear each other or be informed by one another's unique perspective, what you're watching is somebody whose mind has shut down and is threatened by the difference and unable to metabolize that in a mature way to enable them to arrive at real collective intelligence. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there are symptoms writ large at every level of an organizational system, inside an individual leader, inside every dyadic conversation, inside every team dynamic, and inside the organizational architecture that reflect untreated trauma. And so if I want to be moving towards what we might call high performance or excellence of execution or a deliberately developmental organizational climate, I have to do something at the very least to lower the level of fear and create more love and caring, because those are part of the antidote to sort of moving from misaligned exchange to aligned potentiated exchange. How do you think about that in your own teamwork?
Well, I think what we start to look at is this notion of safety. How much safety is present in the system, in the team, and how much threat is present in the team, and their ability to actually have a conversation about safety and threat. And the noticings that we do are around the immobilization nature of threat and trauma. When you see certain people who don't participate, don't engage, don't have conversations, it's not even that they're butting heads, that they're not even engaged, and they withdraw and they retract. And the symptoms are all there for you to see, while others are actually leading the conversations, monopolizing the conversation, believing in a way that decisions are being made and goals are being set and conversations are being had, when in actuality, half the population is not even there. Because
that's already very trauma sensitive, what you just said, Alexander. Because what normally would have the interventionist's attention are the people who are in fight mode, where there's overt conflict and there's overt frayed trust. But actually, it's equally a trauma symptom to look at the people who are imploded and not able to find their voice and not comfortable to contribute and won't bring up a dissenting opinion. And that whole subset of people who are not speaking up, that critical intelligence is then not finding its way into the team outcome. And that's a very high business cost. I mean, your example is exactly why I think trauma literacy is so business relevant.
Absolutely. So with today's complex environment, an anxious environment, ever increasing that we're living, what do leaders need? What do leaders need to have? What are some of the skills, the competencies, the awarenesses, if that's a word, that they need in today's world, in today's organization? What would you say?
So I heard a really interesting new phrase. Some of you guys may have heard this already, but to me it was newer in the last few weeks. So for a long time, we've talked about the Cynefin model and the move from complicated to complex, and how you need different transformational capabilities in a complex world that's not as predictable and not as command and control oriented. You need much more the ability for a leader to be a facilitator and a convener and a dialogue creator. The phrase that I heard this week was BANI, which apparently is a new way of describing that chaos with a double click. So world that's brittle, world that's anxious, world that's nonlinear, world that's incomprehensible. When I heard it, I thought, yeah, that's exactly where we are. So what does a leader need in a BANI world? Well, the first thing you need is a lot of optionality, because if the systems and structures that we count on are so brittle that any one of them might fall apart unexpectedly and abruptly, then we need to have scenarios where we can pivot very easily and a kind of fluidity of our inner life such that if the future looks different than we thought it was going to look a day ago, we can make that pivot. That, the anxious would suggest we need leaders who know how to soothe themselves, who have strategies for centering themselves, who have the self-awareness to know when that anxiety has reached a reactive level and to pause. We need collective practices for cultivating a quality of mindfulness and groundedness that has more resilience in the face of anxiety-producing events. In the nonlinear universe, I think you need intuitive skills. You need the ability to tap into the world of imagination and to dream the future collectively in processes that are joy-filled and lighthearted and co-creative and artistic. So they're tapping into our intuitive understanding of the implicate order, not just the systemic structure. And maybe spirituality comes in most powerfully at the final one. If the world is incomprehensible, I want to get used to dancing with the mystery and tapping into something that's, where I'm sourcing from something wider and more transcendental and transpersonal. So I think practices of devotion, practices of prayer, practices of, collective agitation and activism are all demonstrations of that quality of soulfulness inside organizations.
Oh, I just felt goosebumps, Amy, when you said that. Dancing with the mystery. I just need to hold that for a moment. Let me just hold that because that was really beautiful. One more question for you, which I think is important, and I wrote it down because it's really part of you, this idea of vertical development work in organizations. I know it's very important to you. What does that mean? What does it look like, vertical development? I'm really curious.
Well, maybe I'll say it in terms of our, body of work in organizational psychology. So 20 years ago, the main approach was you could think of now as a sort of cognitive behavioral intervention. Hey, executive, when you're yelling at Mary, it shuts Mary down. It would be better if instead of yelling behavior A, you would ask an open-ended question, behavior B. And why don't you try that? And that leader would probably ask Mary a question once or twice, and within 2 or 3 weeks, they would revert to yelling at them because that was their default mode. And we started to understand, largely guided by the innovative work of Chris Argyris at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, that you had to not just look at the action someone was taking, but what Chris called the frame or the mindset, McKinsey would later call it. It's like looking at the paradigm that somebody's holding that's making that behavior obvious and inevitable. And that if you were able to help somebody shift their mental model, you might get a more sustained change. But as we can hear now with the trauma-informed lens, all of that's a lot of mental change. It's all cognitive intervention. And it turns out it's pretty short-lived. It's not a sustainable sea change of the way someone's being and their default behavioral repertoire. If you want to get that, you have to go much deeper and start looking at in the terrain that we've been talking about, Alexander. You have to explore long-held emotions, fundamental root fears that shape people's perceptions and interpretation systems for making sea change of the way someone's being and their default behavioral repertoire. If you want to get that, you have to go much deeper and start looking at in the terrain that we've been talking about, Alexander. You have to explore long-held emotions, fundamental root fears that shape people's perceptions and interpretation systems for making meaning of their life, their quality of trust and openness. You talked about how safe do people feel on the team. Some of that safety has to do with what's actually happening on the team, and some of that safety has to do with what safety does that executive ever know life is. What safety are they walking into the room with? So we have to go to core fears. We have to go to unmet needs. We have to go to the tenderest parts of their unprocessed grief in their life in order to free them up, to then be able to make a mental shift, to then produce a different automatic behavior. So vertical development, the reason it's important to me is that I think it points us towards the most profound change work. And change work at that level is healing work. And that just touches my heart very much. And it's also a source of great hope for me, because I think until we have permission to work at that level, we're going to be ineffective because we're not actually at the level of the cause. We're at the level of the symptoms on the surface. And I feel like currently as practitioners, we're beginning to get an invitation to work at the roots of the tree.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. I also just wanted to say something about you when we were talking about spirit. So one thing that I love about you, Alexander, and the way that you and Janice have built your firm is it has at its core a quality of human kindness and tenderness that is so trustworthy in you and therefore trustworthy in the people you gather around you and the way that you work. And if you ask me what trauma-informed leadership is, that your heart is a beautiful example of what it looks like live in building a company. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before we move on.
Thank you for saying that.
It's true.
Very kind of you. Let's open it up to questions.
We got a few questions in the chat during the discussion, so I'd love to prioritize those first. First one, it comes from Teresa, and she was asking, Amy, can you say a little bit more about the term under-resourced and what that means?
Yes, so you were talking about the fact that someone with trauma, right, might come to some kind of external circumstance, and you use the word, and they would be under-resourced.
Got
And
it.
so
Got
I
it.
didn't know exactly, like, that's their personal ability to cope. Is that, it just asked you to say a little more.
Fantastic question. Thank you for letting me double click on that. It's multiple things. It's not having the same emotional resilience as somebody who isn't traumatized. It might be not having the same emotional range as somebody who isn't traumatized. It might be not having the same amount of self-contact and emotional experience as somebody who isn't traumatized. It might also be not being able to come out of their point of view. So when you're traumatized and under stress, you get more rigid in your thinking and more persuaded and certain that you're right, which means you're more likely to get, scapegoated as somebody who's difficult to deal with because you're going to create a tension with anybody who sees the world differently than you. It might also mean that you're lonelier and that you don't have the natural social affinity group resource of having a community and feeling like you walk as part of a tribe. It might also mean that you're not sleeping as well and you're not resourced physically in terms of literal life chi. So it's many things. And I'm really probably just touching the surface of the different ways. But what I would want us to all understand is it's meaningfully different level of resource than somebody who has more wholeness inside themselves and isn't still struggling with the aftermath of trauma. And it's a continuum, of course, also.
All right, the next question comes from Jonathan. And
traditionally, coaches can be either blind to trauma or scared of trauma. And I think there's a Goldilocks issue in terms of what's too cold, what's too hot. Just briefly, could you say more about where should coaches who are not clinically trained but trauma sensitive, where should they start to be cautious or where should they not tread?
It's a wonderful question, Jonathan, and it's one we explored vastly in the year-long program. So I don't think I can do full justice to it in a soundbite, but I will say two things. One, I think I am in a radical way pushing the field of coaching to let die this notion that therapists look at the past and the coaches look at the future. I think that's crazily artificial, and it in no way does justice to the depth of work coaches are actually doing with senior leaders. So then the question isn't, are we exploring psychological terrain, but when are we outside of our scope of practice? And I don't think that's a policy answer. I think that's a very individual answer, that each coach has to sort for themselves to some degree. Am I capable of holding this conversation? Am I encountering something that feels outside of my ability to discern what's happening or to know how to contain it and engage it? And I think all of us are being invited on a journey to widen our cup of what we can hold. I would say that if somebody is expressing a danger to themselves or others, and you aren't trauma trained, by definition, you're outside of your scope of practice to be holding that person who's at risk of hurting themselves or someone else. I would say if somebody's actively in a flashbacks where they're losing present time and they're losing the ability to relate to you in real time, probably if you're not psychotherapeutically trained, that person needs to get referred. But if somebody's simply bringing you a story that they've never felt safe enough to share with anyone, and you feel like it's within your capacity to meet it with empathy and not to flinch or shut down yourself and not to get activated in your own history, that we probably can keep stretching that boundary more than we think, and that we can make more of a difference than we've maybe taken license to make. People are very lonely in their untold stories and their uncried tears. And I am a deep believer that anybody with a wide open heart and a attuned relational repertoire has the ability to be a meaningful balm to that isolation. I think we privatized hurt too long. Is that responsive for now, Jonathan? It's such an important question. It's really a deep ethical question.
Yes, thank you. And I put in chat, hopefully with supervision.
So thank you for that added thing. I do think that more, I mean, I generally believe in supervision. Alexander has been longstanding part of our faculty of our professional development arm, the Next Practice Institute, which does training and supervision and clinical oversight. And I also believe in active collaboration with psychotherapists who are trauma trained, and that every coach should have a 1-800 trauma specialist in their speed dial. So that we can get input and we can get guidance, and we don't have to sort by ourselves if our skis are too far over the edge. We can do that in dialogue with somebody who really knows this terrain. So thank you for that addition, Jonathan. That's great.
The next one is from Maria. Maria, feel free to come off of mute and elaborate, but it's around how would you pitch trauma-informed coaching to a new company in terms of what outcomes they can expect, and what would be a measure of success?
I mean, I think the how comes after the when, Maria. So when I would pitch a trauma-informed approach to coaching, which Mobius does both in one-on-one coaching work, and also we've pioneered these 2-day therapeutic retreats where one executive comes and works with a coach and a therapist, or 2 trauma-trained therapists for 2 days. We do 100 of those a year. So there's starting to be real buy-in that this kind of deeper vertical development is needed, particularly at the top of the house, given the level of pressure people are under. So the when is if somebody's bringing me a need for coaching and the executive has already worked with multiple coaches and they haven't got any traction on the change that they're trying to see in the behavioral personality of that executive, that would suggest there's something deeper at play, and that whatever level the coaching has happened up until now isn't getting to that, what I called earlier, the root of the tree. A different moment might be a team that's very stuck in conflict and isn't able to use the conflict as a productive engine towards innovation and disruptive thinking, but actually it's starting to fray the quality of trust in relationship. Or I might use it in the context Alexander brought up earlier, which is I'm having trouble getting the team safe enough to actually take the leap of faith of giving each other honest opinions and feedback. So when there's a kind of interrelational, interpersonal breakdown that doesn't seem to be responding to traditional interventions, that's often a window of opportunity where the HR professional who's trying to solve that problem gets open to and curious about what something deeper might provide. And in terms of how, that's really sort of also says the how. I would say it's not working to get at this from a behavioral lens or even a traditional business coaching lens. That would suggest there's something more profound going on. And it's not actually kind to keep asking the person to change as if simply by matter of will they could change. They've demonstrated that they're stuck. So then we have to give them more holding, not more punishment or more consequences. And then the trauma-informed offering becomes that additional holding and that act of care.
Beautiful.
Next one is from Mike Kincaid. The question is, to what extent do you need to understand the source of someone's childhood trauma in order to be an effective coach?
It's a great question, Mike. And in a way, all these things are so individual and nuanced that I feel a little hesitant to give a kind of universal answer to that question. But I would say a few things. If you can take somebody and accompany them into the emotional experience of the trauma, often the specific narrative doesn't matter quite as much. And many of the times that we're doing trauma healing work, the person doesn't have a story or doesn't have a memory. What they have is a bodily experience of the aftermath, how it lives and walks with them over time. So it's more important to give somebody room and space and holding for the felt experience than the story, I would say.
This next one comes from Gail Thompson. How many organizations actually know they want this? So many are led by D pattern types who have repressed and often disrespect the worlds of emotion and spirit.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Amy. You're singing my song, trained as a psychotherapist, but practicing as a coach and facilitator. I see this stuff all the time, and I'm seeking to have them connect with their spirit as a resource to guide them. And it feels like that's never what anybody is coming from for. It's the root in. And as I look at teams, there is something that the team can do about the dynamics, and there's so much about the individual work. So I'm curious about both who actually purchases it, or are they just purchasing a solution to the problem, not understanding that you're really going to go this route, or do they know they need it? You've answered that a little bit before. And then is your approach both very individual as well as team?
Yeah, again, Gail, it's such a great question. I wish I had a lot of time, but I'll give you in a nutshell the answer. I have both a transparency strategy and a Trojan horse strategy. So depending on who my buyer is on the other side and the language they're using and the energy and transparency with which they share themselves, that gives me cues how overt versus covert I should be about what the nature of the work is. So you can describe everything we've been talking about for the last hour, really in exclusively business terms. Do you want high performing teams? Do you want collective intelligence? Do you want people, leading the industry? Do you want people to feel safe enough to share their dissenting view with their leader? Do you want a feedback rich developmental culture? I could use all the jargon. Do you want collective intelligence? Do you want people, leading the industry? Do you want people to feel safe enough to share their dissenting view with their leader? Do you want a feedback rich developmental culture? I could use all the jargon, and I'd still, in order to deliver that value proposition, I'd still have to do the deeper work. So I'm making a business framework, but I'm pitching the urgency of the inner work, in a sense, interwoven to that argument. And of course, once in a while, I get a buyer on the other side who's done a lot of their own inner work and very quickly resonates with what I'm hinting at and starts asking themselves deeper questions of what does that look like? How do you work with life narrative? How do you work with trauma? And then, of course, you can have a much more overt conversation. I would say that it's a success factor to have at least one ally in the company who knows what you're doing, because otherwise you're at risk of being told that you didn't deliver on what you sold. And that feels like a matter of integrity to me. So that's always very important. And it's also useful when somebody starts to question the business relevance of doing something this deep. To the individual and collective question, in my own work, which is leadership programs, so I don't do one-on-one coaching work, but I do lead programs. We take a group of 24 people for 5 days off-site and offline, and I take them through a guided group journey that gets more and more intimate, more and more expansive, more and more joyful, more and more beloved as the week goes on. And each person steps out for a 3 or 4 hour individual session with a drama therapist to look at their own particular life journey and their own particular life story. So they dance together. And of course, the intimacy and catalytic integration of the one-on-ones becomes part of the perfume that invites people to take more risks in the group process, and the holding and collective intention of the group to do that healing together fuels the courage that people take into their one-on-ones. I really do believe that the outcome is more than the sum of its parts, because it's so synergistic what's happening. And I would just say one more thing, which is most people that come into my leadership programs don't know what they're coming for other than at a soul level, and probably wouldn't come if they knew what it was going to ask of them. But on Friday, they're very grateful. They're reliably grateful. I've very rarely met a leader who isn't thankful to look back at their lives and let certain things go to rest and go to peace, and to be freer, to love the people they love, and to live their gifts, and to feel the pulse of life. You don't have to make much of a business case to get people to sign up for that.
Beautiful. And then what kind of follow-up do you do with them? Because there's that great experience, but then there's taking it back to real life when there's all the pressure and instinct to go back to the old patterns, because those are the ones that are so well grooved.
That's right. And that's why I tend to prefer to work with fewer clients deeper into the organization, because that way when people go back from the program, they're in an ecosystem that together is evolving and is taking on a new way of working. And then it becomes mutually reinforcing instead of sort of pushing towards a recidivism. But you're right, there needs to be some kind of peer holding and peer affirmation and peer process. Otherwise, it's going to be an epiphany experience that doesn't really sustain. So you're pointing at the embedding phase, which is There's a lot of ways to do that, but it's a very important part of the craft. And I know Alexander, when he works with a team, he works longitudinally, so it isn't a one-off experience. You're really taking them on a transformational journey.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Next question comes from, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, Tania. The question is, when the organization is the source of trauma for their employees, but past trauma, and those leaders are now gone from the organization, where do you start?
That's a profound question, and it points at a sort of whole other different level of depth of work. So if you're not trying to do individual healing work in the context of an organization, but you're trying to help an organization heal from its own trauma or make repair with a community it has traumatized, which is another layer of work, sort of the restorative justice dimension of this work, then you're really doing in parallel deep psychospiritual healing and organizational restoration work or mediation work. And that requires a whole other level of expertise. And it's probably more than I could say in response to the question, what that roadmap looks like. But you're correct in your question. It really is a whole other discipline. And I have in the last few years had organizations ask for support to look at where they've been out of alignment with moral choices or out of alignment with relational choices, or they've enabled a leader who's been abusive for a long time and create a lot of pain in that organization, and where you really have to step in and help people to heal what's happened and to look at why they turned the blind spot while the challenge was going on, because there's often a lot of shame and guilt from the executives who colluded with whatever the harm was. So it's a very subtle kind of work, but it's very powerful. And when people do take the time to do that kind of repair work, I think, of course, they're building a kind of inner strength that will serve them in the business as well as in those relationships. I don't know, Alexandra, you want to add anything to that?
I think you're right. For me, there's a collective awareness that comes from the leadership of an organization of the existence of what happened. And there's that awareness, it really comes through self-observation, but you get a sense of awareness and there's a collective ownership, which drives an ability to move the organization forward with a lot of respect and reverence.
That's beautiful.
And delicacy. I mean, it's not delicacy, delicateness. It's not delicacy, delicateness. To be able to drive forward with the right interventions, but without the awareness, the collective awareness, then things don't move forward. And that's a big act. It's a big movement at a leadership level to own, and maybe they don't own the trauma themselves, but they own the fact that it has to get resolved.
Yeah, and it's really precise what you're saying. And in the fertile field of owning or collective responsibility, people start to say what's been unspeakable for a long time, and that itself is very reparative.
Yeah. What I'd like to do now is end the formal part of our time and just take a moment, Amy, to say thank you.
Such a pleasure.
It was such a pleasure to have you. Just a round of applause and hands.
Thank you, everybody.
For you, your wisdom, your generosity, your eloquence, the way you speak, the way you convey these ideas in such a way that we can all relate. You're accessible. It's really wonderful. So it was wonderful to have you today.
For me too.
Amy, it was a pleasure. You're great. Love
Thank
you.
Great to see everybody. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Drew, for hosting us.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Wonderful.
And everybody, thank you for being with us today.